Europe is about to split straight down the middle again. One side pushing back toward the low to mid 40s Celsius under a rebuilding heat dome. The other side finally catching a break with storms and cooler air pouring in off the Atlantic. And the line between those two very different weeks affects millions of people on both sides of it. Stick with me for the next few minutes because I'll walk you through exactly where you land on that divide. And hit subscribe now because I break down what's actually happening with the weather, not just what's scary in a headline. Let's start with the big picture, because 2026 has already been an extraordinary year for heat across Europe, and understanding that background is exactly why this next stretch matters so much. This summer has already produced multiple separate heat waves, stacking one on top of another. The first arrived unusually early, back in late May, with temperatures running as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above normal and breaking all-time records for the season across Spain, the UK, Germany, France, and Ireland. The second hit in June, and it was the big one. An exceptionally intense heat dome that locked itself over Western and Central Europe and simply refused to move, pushing temperatures past 44 degrees Celsius before eventually shifting east as the block broke down. That June event gave Western Europe its hottest June on record, and it came with a genuinely serious human cost, and with the World Health Organization putting the toll at well over 1,000 excess deaths across the continent. To put some specific numbers on just how extreme that stretch actually got, Barcelona recorded its hottest temperature in over a century. Germany hit nearly 42 degrees Celsius at a station near the Polish border for its hottest day on record for a third day running. And Poland set an all-time national high. The United Kingdom broke its own record for the most days in a single year, above 34 degrees Celsius, all while sitting under an amber extreme heat alert covering almost the entire country. National weather. Services across Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic issued red alerts for extreme wildfire danger during that stretch, since the combination of very low humidity, high winds, and extreme heat created exactly the conditions needed for fires to spread quickly and unpredictably. That is the backdrop this current pattern is building on top of. Not a fresh, cool start to summer, but ground and infrastructure already strained by two previous extreme heat events in about 6 weeks, and soil across Iberia and southern France that has barely recovered any moisture since. Now we're watching a third distinct heat event build. And once again, the pattern is splitting the continent into two very different experiences depending on where you happen to live. Here's the actual mechanism driving that split, and it's worth understanding properly rather than just accepting it as a vague forecast. Claim. The jet stream, the fast-moving river of air high above our heads that steers most of Europe's weather, is lifting up toward the north, allowing a deeper trough to dig down over northern Europe and Scandinavia. That dip is what's opening a corridor for cooler air off the North Atlantic to push into the middle of the continent. At the same time, a strong ridge of high pressure is holding firm over western and southwestern Europe, and that ridge keeps pulling in hot air originating from North Africa. Put those two features together and you get exactly the divided pattern. Meteorologists have been tracking cooling and storms working their way through Central Europe, while the west and southwest stay locked under building heat, in some cases watching that heat intensify even further as the week goes on. It helps to understand why forecasters place so much weight on this particular jet stream shape. When the jet stream runs relatively flat and straight, weather moves through quickly, and no single region gets stuck under the same conditions for long. But when it buckles into a large ridge and trough pattern like this, 1. Weather systems get trapped, holding position for days rather than sliding through. That's the same mechanism behind the blocking pattern that drove June's record heat, just reshaped into a configuration that divides the continent rather than parking heat over one region. If a clear explanation like that is what you actually want from a weather channel instead of just scary maps with no context, drop a like on this video because it genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people. Let's talk about the western side of this split first, because that's where the most intense. France are moving back into a hot, dry, high-pressure regime, and forecasters are watching temperatures climb toward the low to mid-40s Celsius across Spain and Portugal, with similarly extreme readings possible across central, western, and southwestern France, potentially touching 45 degrees Celsius in the most anomalous pockets. That kind of heat is enough to challenge regional July records, and it's arriving on top of ground already exceptionally dry from the earlier waves this summer, which means the heat compounds an already serious drought rather than starting from a clean slate. Southern England is also likely to get pulled toward the edge of the same hot, dry pattern as the week develops, sitting on the boundary. Between warm continental air and cooler, more unsettled conditions arriving from the northwest, it's worth understanding why dry ground makes a heat wave worse rather than simply hotter. When soil holds moisture, some of the sun's energy gets used evaporating that moisture rather than directly heating the air above it, a natural cooling effect similar to how sweat cools your skin. Once soil dries out completely, that buffer disappears, and nearly all of the sun's energy goes directly into heating the air instead, which is part of why a heat wave arriving on an already dry summer tends to feel more intense and produce higher peaks than the same pattern would after a wetter spring. Now here's the eastern and central side of the story, and this is genuinely the more comfortable half of the split, at least temporarily. Central Europe and parts of Eastern Europe are getting a real, if temporary, break from the worst of the heat, with cooler air pushing in from the northwest and a series of thunderstorms moving through as that front works its way across the continent, firing up near the Alps and northern Italy first, then shifting toward southeastern Europe over the following days. Some of these storms carry real teeth. Where the atmosphere is most unstable, expect the possibility of severe weather, meaning damaging downburst winds, large hail in some spots, and in the more intense pockets, even an isolated tornado can't be ruled out. Areas from Switzerland, Austria, and Slovenia down through Croatia and Bosnia are in the front line for the first wave, with Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary picking up showers and storms shortly after, and the activity continuing to slide toward Romania, Ukraine, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and North Macedonia as the pattern progresses. It's worth explaining briefly why this particular type of storm tends to turn severe so reliably during a pattern like this one. When a pocket of relatively cool, dense air pushes in at the leading edge of a front and runs into air that has been baking under days of heat and humidity buildup, that sharp contrast creates enormous instability, forcing warm, moist air near the ground rapidly upward and fueling the tall, powerful thunderstorm clouds capable of producing large hail, sudden destructive wind gusts, and in the most extreme cases, brief tornadoes. The bigger the contrast between the two air masses colliding, the more violent the resulting storms tend to be. It's also worth being honest about what these storms will and won't actually accomplish. And these downpours don't do a whole lot for the underlying drought conditions in most of the affected areas. You get a quick, heavy burst of rain that runs off fast, rather than soaking deeply into ground that's already baked hard from weeks of heat, which means there's a real risk of flash flooding in low-lying areas even while the broader drought barely improves. Soil dried out for weeks, develops a hardened crust-like surface, especially where clay content is high. And that surface actually repels water rather than absorbing it, much like water beating up and running off a dry sponge before it eventually soaks in. So if you're in one of these storm target zones, watch for lightning, watch for sudden localized flooding, but don't expect this rain to meaningfully fix the dry conditions built up across the continent all summer. Let's talk specifically about the north for a moment, because Scandinavia and the Baltic states are sitting in a genuinely interesting spot within this whole pattern. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic states have generally been running cooler than areas further south this stretch, with daytime readings mostly sitting in the high teens to low 20s Celsius. But there's a specific detail worth flagging for Finland and the Baltic states in particular, because the rainfall totals building up there over the coming days are genuinely significant, with some areas potentially seeing accumulated multi-day totals well over 100 millimeters, raising real flash flooding potential, even though the broader story for that part of Europe is comfortable, below average temperatures rather than heat. As that storm track lifts up towards Scandinavia, it channels a repeating stream of weather systems along roughly the same path, one disturbance after another, which is exactly how a place with moderate temperatures can still end up facing serious flash flood risk purely from repeated rainfall stacking up day after day. Here's the part of this forecast that really matters if you're trying to plan more than a couple of days ahead, because the pattern doesn't stay static. As the week progresses, that western ridge of high pressure is expected to build in even further, meaning the heat over Iberia, France, and the near continent doesn't just hold steady, it's forecast to intensify. Some areas working back toward Spain in particular could be looking at daytime highs pushing up toward the mid-40s, and Paris sits right on the edge of what would be classified as significant heat by that point too. Meanwhile, over toward the eastern half of the continent, temperatures generally continue trending in the opposite direction, staying below average or dropping further as that cooler, stormier pattern holds its ground longer in places like Ukraine and the surrounding region. That divide between a strengthening western heat dome and a persistently cooler, wetter eastern half of the continent is really the whole story of this coming week compressed into one sentence. It's worth understanding why this seesawing pattern, hot one week, a partial break the next, then heat building right back up, has become such a recognizable feature of recent European summers rather than a one-off event. This year alone has produced 3 distinct heat waves layered across May, June, and now July, each separated by only brief periods of relief. Copernicus, the EU's climate monitoring service, has described this relentless succession of waves as a hallmark of a warming climate, where the atmospheric blocking patterns responsible for trapping heat in place are becoming more frequent and more stubborn, holding position longer before finally breaking down. There's also a genuine health dimension worth more attention than it usually gets. One of the more dangerous aspects of a prolonged heat pattern involves tropical nights, meaning nights where the temperature never drops below 20 degrees Celsius. In cities where concrete and asphalt hold onto daytime heat, those warm nights prevent the body from properly recovering before the next hot day begins, which is a big part of why extended heat waves get more dangerous the longer they persist, rather than staying constant. That's exactly why health authorities across Spain, Portugal, France, and southern England tend to issue their strongest warnings not on the single hottest afternoon, but several days into a sustained stretch, once that lack of overnight recovery has had time to build up. The people most at risk are consistently the same groups: older adults living alone without reliable air conditioning, infants and young children, outdoor workers who can't avoid midday heat, and anyone managing a heart O, or respiratory condition. Simple precautions help here: staying hydrated throughout the day, avoiding strenuous outdoor activity during early afternoon, keeping living spaces cool by closing blinds and checking in directly on older relatives or neighbors. There's also a less obvious consequence of this kind of sustained heat worth understanding: how power plants cool themselves down. Nuclear plants across parts of Europe rely on river water for cooling, and when that water is already running unusually warm because of a prolonged heat wave, returning even warmer water back into the river can damage the surrounding ecosystem. Environmental regulations designed to prevent that harm can force plants to reduce output precisely when electricity demand for air conditioning is highest, and that dynamic already played out visibly during June, with several plants across France required to cut output during the hottest stretches of the month. So here's how to actually use all of this. If you're in Spain, Portugal, France, or southern England, the trend is unmistakably upward, building toward genuinely serious heat by the latter part of the week on already dried out ground. So plan around the hottest part of the afternoon. Stay hydrated and check in on anyone vulnerable. If you're across Central Europe, from the Alps through Poland, Czechia, Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary, expect a genuine, if temporary, break from the worst heat. But stay alert for thunderstorms carrying real potential for damaging wind gusts, large hail, and localized flash flooding, particularly during the first half of the week. If you're in southeastern Europe, from Romania and Ukraine down through Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and North Macedonia, that same storm risk arrives later, so watch the back half of the week. And if you're up in Scandinavia or the Baltic states, temperatures stay comfortably below the extremes further south, but watch closely for the heavy rainfall building up, especially across Finland and the Baltics, where flash flood risk is actually concentrated. It's also worth remembering that a pattern like this rarely resolves in a single clean, tidy way. Blocking patterns like this one tend to wobble before they fully break down, meaning a region expecting relief could see a brief return of heat, and a region baking under the ridge could see the first signs of change arrive a day or two earlier or later than expected. That uncertainty is normal for a pattern this large, and it's exactly why staying updated matters more than fixating on a single number from a forecast issued days in advance. None of this is the kind of story with a single dramatic ending. It's a genuinely fluid pattern, and the exact line between the hot side and the cooler, stormier side of the continent can shift by a day or two in either direction as new data comes in. If you want the accurate, updated version of this story as the pattern continues developing through the week, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I'll keep tracking exactly where that heat and storm divide ends up landing, and I'd rather you get that update here than piece it together from scattered headlines somewhere else. Stay safe out there, whichever side of the split you happen to be on this week, and have a good one.